working. Good morning. I am a guest speaker today. I've come to talk to you, so I just invite you all to come a little closer because everyone seems to be really far away. So if you care to, if it's convenient or if you're able, I just welcome you to come a little further forward. So my name is Julia, and I'm part of the women's ministry team for our conference, and I'm the End It Now coordinator. And End It Now is an initiative by the World Church and also by the NAD to address issues around abuse. And abuse can be a really uncomfortable topic, but it's something that we need to start talking about more. It's something that our church members, some of them are facing and experiencing. And in our joint adult Sabbath school, we want to talk about how we can keep our children safe. We are hearing on the news all the time about issues that there are issues of child sexual abuse, and we would definitely want to do everything we can to protect our children. Amen? Okay, so what I want to do is I want to have a little bit of information first about the situation around child sexual abuse, but I want to leave you with some information on how you can prevent it, because really we want to keep our children safe. We want to make sure that they're safe and secure and they're protected. So I just want to start with a Bible verse. It's Luke 17, verse 2, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It says, "It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble." So let us make sure that we do everything we can to protect our little ones from stumbling. So I want to start off with perhaps a little bit of a Q&A. There are a lot of myths around abuse, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I know Sabbath School is usually a little interactive, so this is the opportunity for everyone to speak up. So I have some statements, and I want you to call out if you think it's true or false. Okay? There we go. Okay, so number one, children often make up stories about abuse because they have big imaginations. What do we think about that? False. Doing well so far. False reports of child sexual abuse are rare, and usually it's 4 to 8% of all allegations, which means overwhelmingly when we hear a disclosure from a child, it's most likely true. Most of the fabricated reports are made by adults in custody disputes or by adolescents. So with our little children especially, it increases in likelihood that it is actually true. Okay, went too far. Okay, children are likely to disclose if someone has abused them. Right. Okay, 73% of children wait at least 1 year to disclose abuse. 43% wait at least 5 years. Which means that we're perhaps not likely to know what's happening with our children. We're not likely to know what's going on, which can be a little concerning. So we're going to work a little bit later, we're going to work on how we can change that and how we can encourage our children to tell us what's happening with them. Okay, number 3, I've reduced my child's risk of abuse by teaching them about stranger danger. Okay. Went a little far. So in actual fact, it does slightly reduce the risk. However, 90% of children are abused by someone they know. We often see on TVs and movies that children are snatched in the back of a big old van, but in reality, overwhelming majority is by someone your child knows. And particularly with our younger children, if they're under 6, it's a 50% chance that it's a family member. So while it's important to tell our children not to take candy from a stranger, overwhelmingly the likelihood is that it will be someone that your child knows and therefore that you also know. And we just need to keep that information in our mind when we look at keeping our children safe. Absolutely, someone they love. And we're going to talk about grooming in a little bit. Number 4, most cases of child abuse happen in a home or residence. Right. 84% of sexual victimization under the age of 12 occurs in a residence. So that's telling us that that's people that we would let into our home. That's people that we would let our children go to their home. People we trust, people that we have a relationship with. No. There we go. Yep, there we go. So most likely the perpetrator is trusted. Number 5, children can sexually abuse other children. Right. As many as 40% of children who are abused by older or more powerful children. The younger the child victim, the more likely it is that the perpetrator is a juvenile. And when children are under 6, that goes up to 43%. So it's sometimes we think that children perhaps wouldn't do that, but in fact, we need to be monitoring, particularly our older children, our teens, our youth. We need to be monitoring them the same way that we would monitor adults. Hopefully, having 2 adults, we wouldn't also leave teens alone with children. Okay. Homosexuals perpetrate sexual abuse more than heterosexuals. Right, false. Sometimes this myth can occur due to the abuse that we hear about perhaps in the Catholic Church with priests, but actually they're not any more likely. So to think that that may be the biggest risk is not the case. Number 7, children living with both parents are less likely to be abused. Okay, I'm hearing mixed responses. Here we go. Children living without either parent, in the case of foster care, are 10 times more likely to be sexually abused than children who live with both biological parents. Children who live with a single parent with a live-in partner are at the highest risk. So that's the step-parents or perhaps if there's a live-in partner, children living in that household are at the highest risk, 20 times more likely. Okay, so let's look a little bit about grooming, because this links into our myth of stranger danger being our biggest risk. But in actuality, it's people in our social circle, it's people in our world that build relationships with our children and with us as well. Yep. So the purpose of grooming, and these are key things that we all as adults need to be watching out for. How do we protect our child? We're looking for grooming. Rarely are there instances where a child is just abused without grooming. So this is the key thing to be aware of so that we can intervene before something happens. Okay, so the purpose of grooming is to manipulate the perceptions of other adults around the child. The child is not the only person that is groomed. It is, in fact, the whole family. The adults are groomed just as much as the child, and sometimes the whole community is groomed. We're groomed to accept a certain perception of the perpetrator and also of the child. So there's a manipulation of the situation. And there's a really interesting documentary on Netflix right now. It's called, I believe, Abducted in Plain Sight, and it talks about how a man grooms a family, so much so that he actually abducts their daughter twice. And when you start to understand about how insidious and deviant grooming is, you'll see that we really give some people a lot more trust than perhaps we should. So did you have a question? That's okay. We'll, when you remember, just let me know. Okay, so the purpose of grooming is also to manipulate the child into becoming a cooperating participant. So it's misrepresenting what the perpetrator wants to do, misrepresenting the relationship that they're trying to create because they don't want to be caught and they want the child to think of this as a loving relationship rather than the abuse that it is. Okay? Yeah, and as I said, they're manipulating the perception that they're a good person and that they're in the church for right reasons when they're in fact not. Absolutely, we do. And that's often used against us, unfortunately, and we're going to touch on that in a little bit. Also, the purposes of grooming is to reduce the likelihood of the child being believed. And again, this is where perceptions are manipulated around the child. So perhaps the perpetrator is saying, your child sure lies a lot, planting those seeds, or saying they have a big imagination, they like to make up stories, these kinds of things. And then, of course, to reduce the likelihood of abuse being detected because they don't want to go to jail. Okay, so aspects of grooming include targeting the victim. They're choosing the person that they're going to focus on, securing access to and isolating the victim. They want to be alone with the child. They want permission to be able to be alone with the child. Gaining the child's trust, and this also includes the family's trust, and controlling and concealing the relationship. Secrecy is a key part of abuse. So these are some examples of grooming behaviours. It's not completely comprehensive, and predators may not display all these behaviours, but these are some things to start thinking of and looking for potentially when perhaps a new adult becomes part of your life, or even just the adults that are already part of your life. An adult may seem particularly interested in a child. They may create opportunities to be alone with them, or many children. They become fixated, they give special privileges, they befriend the family, but they're much more interested in creating a relationship with the child. An adult displays favoritism to one child within a family, so maybe Uncle Bob only likes his niece Sally, doesn't pay much attention to the other children. Huh? Oh, sorry, my father's name's Robert, so just the nickname of Bob, sorry. And my father's nothing, he hasn't done anything, it's just a name that comes to mind. So sorry to all the Bobs. An adult finds opportunities to buy a child gifts, trying to create that relationship, catering to their interests, so that a child or the parent may initiate contact. So perhaps that's a coach offering to give rides to and from practice, perhaps it's a teacher offering private after-school sessions. They're catering to the child's interests so that the parent will allow them to be alone. And an adult who displays age and gender preferences. Okay, so I know that everything that we've just kind of gone over might be a little bit scary, it might be a little bit horrifying, but there is a lot that actually you as parents and guardians and church members can do to protect the children in your community. And there's two main categories that comes under. The first one is to educate your child. Information is power. Knowledge is power. And we need to be educating our children about the risks that they may face, and educating children so that they know what to do. So the first one is to teach children about their bodies and about safe and unsafe touch. And there's a lot of really great books that can help you as a guide. If you would like to know more about some resources, I'm happy to chat with any of you afterwards. I'll be here for the lunch, and I'll be here after the lunch if anyone wants to talk more about this. But if you're not sure how to go about it, I know that my generation, and certainly generations before me, we tended to not have those talks. It was uncomfortable. We didn't talk much about it. So perhaps if you haven't had someone talk to you when you were a child, you're not so sure how to go about that, come see me and I'd be happy to share some resources. So there's some age-appropriate books that you can be talking with your children about how to keep their bodies safe. We need to be teaching children about secrets, remembering that abuse depends on secrecy for it to continue. Abusers need secrecy so that they're not caught, so that their parents will not protect their children, and so that the child will keep going back to them. So we teach our children about secrets, and children shouldn't be asked to keep secrets. Children shouldn't be keeping secrets from their parents. So instead of teaching children to have secrets, we teach them, if someone asks you to keep a secret, you have to come tell me immediately. So and teaching our children about secret gifts and secret favors. You know, Mr. Smith at church said he has a gift for me in his car, but I shouldn't tell you. They're teaching our kids to tell us because they may not recognize grooming, but as adults we can. And secret favors, secret attention, that would indicate that there's a strong possibility of grooming. And we want to really intervene with our children before things progress past grooming. And fostering a safe environment for open communication with your child. And this is a lot more work than the other two because it means developing a daily relationship where you're the parent that your child wants to talk to, where you're the parent or grandparent or family member that your child feels comfortable telling these kind of things, where they're not afraid that they'll be punished or blamed, where they're not embarrassed or shy, but they feel comfortable telling these things of this adult has said this or this adult has done that. There is a tragically large number of stories where children have disclosed abuse to their parents and they were punished and they were shamed for what was done to them by an adult. Okay. The next aspect is to protect your children. We need to do a lot better at supervision, especially at younger ages. This includes physical supervision, knowing where your child is. Often we're fairly relaxed in group settings, perhaps at potluck. You have no idea where your child is and you haven't seen them for an hour. You just assume that they're playing in another part of the church. Predators are certainly watching for who is easier to target, and children who are physically supervised are a lot more difficult to target. Another example is of sending our little children off to the bathroom during the church service. You know, they're unprotected, they're alone. You don't know who might be out in the corridor waiting for them. You don't know who's watching that. It takes just 2 minutes to take them yourself, especially our little ones. For our older ones, we want to be monitoring who is contacting them, knowing who is contacting them on their phones, who is calling them, who is texting them. We need to be aware of who's doing that. There's social media. There's a lot of stories where children are groomed over social media, someone pretending to be someone they know or pretending to be someone their own age, and it turns out that it is a sexual predator grooming them to meet up in person. Or maybe it's someone they already know that is just using social media as a way to secretly contact your child. You should be aware of what they're doing on the internet, aware of their social media accounts and who is trying to contact them for their own safety. The next point is to meet your child's attention needs. Children need attention, they want attention. Sometimes that can feel a little overwhelming, but it's a natural part of development, and children are very vulnerable when their attention needs are not met by parents and other safe adults. And that makes them very vulnerable when they may feel a little bit ignored because someone else comes along offering them all the attention that they're wanting. So we need to be more mindful about putting down our phones, our devices, turning off the TV, and investing emotionally in our children. We need to be aware of other children that your child might consciously or unconsciously share abuse information about. We are, of course, trying to protect the children in our lives, not just our own children, but how can we protect our children's friends too? Educating our children about helping their friends who may be victims. Educating our children about potential grooming behaviours. And then lastly, listening to our gut. As some people think that our gut feeling, some people call it intuition, some people believe that the Holy Spirit is warning them, but sometimes we just get a bad feeling and we're not quite sure why. And sometimes we silence that because we think, oh, well, you know, I'd be so rude to say no to that person. I'd be so rude to not allow them into my life. But we need to pay attention to that, especially when we're considering the safety and protection of our children. So I have two examples just on how to help your children's friends, just so you can see what that might look like. So I'll just read this example quickly. It says, your 10-year-old son comes home and complains that his soccer coach favours Jimmy, even though he isn't the best player. Coach buys him new equipment and drives him home after practice. Even took him to a movie one time, and it's just so unfair, just because his dad is overseas in Iraq. Now we can see that potentially Coach is just a really nice person who's helping this child out because, you know, his mom is having to single parent at this time. But also potentially he's singling out Jimmy because he is vulnerable and possibly there's something else going on there. So that might be worth having a conversation with Jimmy's mum about what your son shared and have her perspective on that. Okay. Another example is a child is abused by their Uncle Bob, sorry Bob, and tells their best friend at school. Their best friend, your child, sympathizes but doesn't know what to do, and the information goes nowhere and the abuse continues. So up to 40% of disclosures by children are made to their friends, and little is done about it because children don't know what to do. And the best gift that we can give them in that situation is teaching our children. If your friend shares something, to tell you immediately. That's a big burden for our children to have to carry alone, knowing that someone is hurting their friend and they don't know what to do. So it's best that we teach them to pass that burden to us so that we can help their friends. Because when they grow up, they may feel a lot of guilt. And I've spoken to several adults now who did have that experience as a child, and they feel a lot of guilt now because they didn't help their friend, but they were also not given the tools to help their friend. So let's just be aware that we're helping our children to stay safe, and we're helping them to help their friends too. Okay, so I just want to touch quickly on what I call the brazenness of predators. Sometimes we think that because something is happening in front of our eyes that it couldn't possibly be what we think it is. Surely they wouldn't do that in front of my face. Surely they wouldn't be doing that with me right here. I must have misunderstood. They must just be socially awkward. They must have not realized what they did or said. But I would like to encourage you that if it doesn't look right or seem right or feel right, it probably isn't. Long experience of not being caught makes predators very confident and very relaxed. Unfortunately, the conviction rate for child sexual abuse is very low, and so they become very confident that they will never be caught, and so they may do things with other adults present. There are parents that say that surely it wouldn't happen if I'm in the same car, if I'm in the same room. You know, perhaps one parent is sleeping and the other parent is molesting their child in the bed with them. It can and it will happen. So if you feel that something is wrong, again, listen to that intuition, listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. They certainly will be bold enough to do things in front of you. Okay, so what can we as churches do? We've looked at what we can do as parents and guardians and family members. What can churches do? Because we all want to keep our kids safe. We want this to be a sanctuary. We want this to be a place where children have treasured memories of growing up and not fearful or sad ones because someone hurt them in some way. So what can we as churches do? Okay, the first thing is that we need to screen all our volunteers through Verified Volunteers. This is an NAD policy. It's our conference policy. Should be your church policy. So I encourage all of you, if you have not yet done that, it is very important that we do so. It's unfortunate how many churches discover that someone who's been with them, sometimes for decades, actually is a registered sex offender, and they just never bothered to check, and they've been allowing them access to innocent and vulnerable children. So we need to be very aware that we are screening for that. Verified Volunteers is the program. Your pastor knows about that. So if that's something that you need to do, please do so as soon as possible. And the reason why we all need to do it is because if someone is refusing to do it, it makes them stand out. And we have to ask some questions why they're refusing to do that. And they stand out because the rest of us comply. So we really need to work on that so that the people stand out for the right reasons, not just because we don't feel like it. Just something to note, I don't want anyone to get a little zealous in screening people. While these positions working with minors can attract pedophiles, please don't go on a witch hunt for your Sabbath school leaders or your Pathfinder leaders. Most likely they're good people. I don't know them, but probably they are. It's just about having an awareness that people may be attracted to those positions if they have other intentions, because it allows them to be around children. Doesn't mean that everyone who does that has bad intentions. The next thing we need to do is working on making your church structure a more protective place. Now, I'm not familiar with your building. This is the first time that I've been here. But perhaps we might need to put some windows in the children's ministry rooms so that there's so if someone's walking past, you can look in and see. Perhaps we need to be locking closets, locking storage rooms or other rooms when they're not in use. We just don't want to create isolated spaces that people can access and that they can be alone with children. So if it's not in use, it's a good idea that it's being locked up. Maybe you might need greeters. If there's isolated areas, maybe you have long corridors or passageways that most people aren't around, especially during your sermon. Maybe you need some greeters or volunteers to just monitor that. And lastly, newcomers need to have a waiting period before holding church positions that involve children. And our conference recommends a waiting period of at least 6 months. And part of the reason is an immediate deterrent because they're having to wait. But also, it gives us a chance to do a little background check into people that are new. Oftentimes, sexual predators will church hop. As soon as people start to catch on as to what they might be doing, they'll move to avoid being arrested or to avoid suspicion, and maybe it's a little bit difficult, so they'll move on. So we want to be, of course, welcoming to our newcomers, but trust needs to be earned a little bit before we just allow people access to our children. Okay. I would strongly recommend that you develop your own child protection policy specific to your church. Your church has its location, it has its building structure. Maybe there are certain things about your church that that make you different to other churches. So it's always ideal to have a very specific child protection policy that you have in your church that all church members know. And that includes a protocol for leaders to follow if a child makes a disclosure about sexual abuse. So just be aware we have what's called mandated reporters. And a mandated reporter is someone who is required by law to share all information shared by children about potential abuse. And so your pastor is one of them. Often medical personnel are considered mandated reporters. Teachers are mandated reporters. And there may be other professions as well that are mandated reporters. So please be aware that if you are a mandated reporter, but also people need to know who they can tell to make sure this gets to the police. So I'd recommend you develop a policy around that. We also want to have the 2-adult rule. When we're working with children, 2 adults should be present. And I know that can be difficult perhaps in smaller churches. I understand that you have a reasonable sized congregation, so that shouldn't necessarily be an issue. And keep in mind, as we referred to earlier, this should apply to older teens or youth as well. We need 2 adults. We usually have a 2-adult rule when we have counting tithe and money, and surely our children are so much more important than that. So we need to really emphasize the 2-adult rule so we're not seen as a soft target for predators, and that we're just ensuring that there's always multiple adults supervising our children. And lastly, when a child makes a disclosure, the police should be involved every time. The police are very skilled at assessing whether a disclosure is credible or not. Most of us don't have training in that, and so we need to let those who are professionals make the assessment. Okay, so I just want to end just the risk of doing nothing. When children are abused and their disclosures, maybe they don't tell people. We heard in the beginning that children will often wait to tell people, or perhaps they will tell their friends and their friends can't help them. But the risk of having nothing happen, the risk of children not being helped, it's pretty grim. It's tragic, actually, what happens to children. They just increase dramatically in risk for a lot of really sad things. So firstly, survivors of childhood sexual abuse are 10 to 13 times more likely to attempt suicide. Half of all men and 2/3 of all women in drug treatment centres report past sexual or physical abuse. Other children may be molested because the predator wasn't stopped. And in addition, some children who experience sexual abuse may go on to abuse other children. And so there's a lot of risk of doing nothing. So really we need to be making sure that if a child makes a disclosure, we're doing something about that. So that's the first part of Sabbath School. I just have a second part, which is a little shorter, and then we'll follow on from this for the sermon. I know that it can be an uncomfortable topic. I know it can feel a little overwhelming, but it's really important that we do have these conversations so that we are protecting our children, protecting our vulnerable children. The other thing that I just wanted to mention as well, just before I start this next one, is that the other implication of not protecting our children is that what image does it give them of God? What image does it give them of our church? How does it affect their spiritual life? When someone who's trusted, when someone who is claiming to be a Christian hurts them in this way, how does that affect their spiritual life and their path that they're going to take? So that's just something to reflect on, and I hope that we will take on some of these things and help to protect our kids. The next module is on abusers in church. This is a kind of a shorter one, but it's just so we can be aware of perhaps the people that prey on our children. And there's also quite a bit of overlap with domestic violence abusers, and we're going to follow on in our sermon on domestic violence. Okay, so let me just pull this up really quickly. So I just have the picture of the sheep in wolf's clothing because that essentially is what abusers are. They pretend to be sheep like the rest of us. And as someone commented earlier, we are very trusting with people in our church. But the Bible warns us many times that not everyone who is here has the same intentions and has the same mind as us. Okay, so James 1 verse 8 says, "A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." The double life and the double mind of claiming to follow Christ on one hand, but living a lifestyle that causes pain and harm to others is usually rooted in selfishness and an unwillingness to submit to God. Okay. And a double-minded life is often rooted in two things, and we've touched on these briefly in child protection. It depends on secrecy, and this is to hide what they're doing so that people will think they're a good person on the outside, but inside there's a lot of evil and there's a lot of turning away from God. It also relies on manipulating public perception. If we thought that abusers were bad people, we probably wouldn't help them as we unwittingly do. We probably wouldn't support them, and we would be more likely to help the people that they're hurting. Okay. 1 John 1, 5 and 6 says, "God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth." And this is something that we will often see with abusive people. They're claiming to have light. They're claiming to be in fellowship with God, yet really they walk in darkness. A lot of us have assumptions about our church. We have assumptions about the people who attend it. You know, most of us think, I love God. I'm here because I love God. I'm walking in my journey with him. And we assume that other people are all the same. And most of the time that's true, but other times it's not. And there are people who are here to have other motives. They have more deviant motives, and they're well aware of these assumptions. One researcher found that abusers say that churches are easier to manipulate and to fool because we tend to trust the people that walk through our doors. Okay. So one of these researchers, Anna Salter, she says, over and over we confuse likability with trustworthiness, familiarity with safety, warmth with caring. Niceness is a decision. Predators, we think, should at least have the decency to be rude. Right? We have a stereotype of what abusive people are like, and maybe it involves a white singlet and a beer belly and, you know, openly abusive. Maybe they're in a gang. maybe there's certain stereotypes that we have, but really predators could look and seem like anyone. And a lot of this niceness, as we just read, is a decision. It's an act to deceive the people around them. And in domestic violence abuse, we often see grooming as well. Women are groomed into abusive relationships, and communities are groomed to think that abusers are someone they're not. 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And that's something that we need to start striving for as well. We can't be deceived by someone's job or someone's financial status or other things that perhaps fool us, or perhaps even their position in church. We need to start looking at their heart and asking God to give us wisdom, asking God to give us discernment, so that we can make better choices. Okay, John 7:24 says, "Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." Matthew 10. There's a lot of verses, actually. When we start to look for it, there's a lot of verses in the Bible that are warning us that not everyone will seem as they really are. Not everything is as it is on face value. And the Bible warns us, it says, "I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." Jesus acknowledges that we, his people, will be surrounded by wolves. Some of them will appear as wolves very clearly, but some will not. Some will be like wolves in sheep's clothing. Jesus says not to be shrewd as sheep. He doesn't say to be shrewd as doves. He said to be shrewd as snakes. And who do we often hear referred to as a snake in the Bible? Satan, absolutely. And we need to be smart as to how Satan works. We need to understand how he works. The Bible calls Satan the father of lies. And so understanding that deception is a key part of abuse and is a key part of those who choose to follow Satan. And understanding that and having the shrewdness and wisdom is what we need to have so that we can protect our children and protect women and sometimes men who are also being abused as well. This is a quote from Bishop John Harrower. He is a strong advocate for those who are experiencing domestic violence. He says, "Jesus told his followers they need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, but most churches are not wise about the mentality and tactics of evildoers, nor are they aware of how evildoers masquerade as believers in the church. The abuser typically has a Dr. Jekyll persona that depicts him, or occasionally her, as a wonderful and godly person so that no one would suspect the truth. If the victim reports the abuse to church leaders, the abuser is skilled at shifting blame, evading accountability, and pretending repentance and reformation. The vast majority of church leaders aren't discerning enough to detect these tactics of abusers for what they are, lies, and often advise the victim to remain with or return to the abuser." We need to be aware that not everything is as it seems, and often these can be barriers for us helping people. And we're going to touch on this a lot more when we have our sermon about domestic violence and how we can help women that are in that situation. And again, just as I mentioned in the previous presentation, when we talk about church positions that may attract predators, doesn't mean that people in those positions are predators. So just to touch a little bit more on this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of personality switch, we need to remember that people who are abusive in private are intelligent enough to realize that if they behave that way in front of us, then they're most likely going to jail. So there's a lot of grooming and deception involved. Maybe that involves being very active in the church, being very helpful. One lady shared that her husband would make sure that he volunteered at a soup kitchen on holidays, so that when people would say, "How was your Thanksgiving?" he could say, "I was at the soup kitchen." And so people would think that he was a good person, and the way that he treated her was incredibly abusive. But he created a persona that was something different to his true nature. So we need to be very careful in cases of abuse, making sure that even though someone seems like a nice person, that may not always be the case. Too often we confuse knowing people for a long time and knowing people well. And if we've known someone for 10 years, maybe at church, we've seen them for 3 or 4 hours once a week, do we really know what that person's doing the other 6 days of the week? Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't as well as we think we might. And so we need to keep an open mind so that we're able to help people that are trapped in abusive situations. So we're going to touch on that more during the sermon. If anyone has any questions about child protection, I'll be around between the sermon and now. And also there's a potluck. So if anyone wants to talk then or after lunch, I'll be available as well. So does anyone have any questions on anything I've presented so far? Okay, well, thank you for listening, and I'll be speaking further